Hi, my name is Arlen Walker, and I am live from Pelm's Wasteland. And today I am doing the first of maybe a series. I don't know. I haven't um, been particularly regular about recording things for YouTube in a while. Um, but the idea is to talk about some of the books that I've read recently, things that I think are interesting and worth sharing with you all and all that. So today I am going to talk about two books. It's a duology, I think is the terminology that people normally use for, right, kind of like a trilogy, but with two. Anyway, these are two books by George Shipway, who wrote a number of historical fiction books. I am not super familiar with his work, broadly speaking, but I read these two books and thought they were pretty good. Both of them were published in the 70s. I don't remember how much time there was between Warrior and Bronze and King and Splendor, but these are two historical fiction novels that are about the character of Agamemnon, who, if you are familiar with Greek mythology and especially with Homer's Iliad, Agamemnon is a major character in that story, of course, and then has a number of other kind of mythological and semi historical details associated with him. Agamemnon in the Iliad is the king of Mycenae or Mycenae, which is arguably the most powerful city state in Greece. And he is essentially the leader of the Greek expedition to attack the city of Troy. His brother Menelaus is Helen's husband, who is Helen being um, abducted or seduced, or however you want to describe her removal from the city of Sparta to Troy by Paris of Troy, which sets off the Trojan War. Although in these books, that is um, a sort of a pretext for the war, because this is very much the a real the story behind the myth kind of story, I guess you might say. Seems like there are a number of historical fiction stories that fit in that kind of category. When I was in middle school, it must have been the first time I read. Bernard Cornwell has a series, a trilogy about King Arthur that is very similar in the sense of being sort of blending a number of the events that we are familiar with from the sort of mythologized tale into a much more grounded story that is um, sort of designed to reflect much more of the reality of the particular historical period in particular. That there's the the Iliad itself, in part because it was orally transmitted for so long, and across a number of different authors, presumably. Even though we kind of group it all under Homer, the sort of historical details blend a number of different periods. There are elements that match up with what we know about the late Bronze Age civilization, and then elements that have more to do with later periods that are added into the text over time. And so this series essentially attempts to take a lot of those later anachronisms out, and to present something that, like I said, it has a lot of the moments that we are familiar with, or the events that we are familiar with from the mythologized version of the tale, while presenting a grittier, more realistic version of that story, something more in line with the archaeological evidence of the period, than the sort of mythologized version of the tale. And Agamemnon is kind of an interesting character to approach in that way. In the Iliad, he is, I think the general consensus would say, is not shown to be particularly likable. Certainly is he's basically the cause of, or one of the principal causes of the kind of original conflict of the Iliad as a sort of subset of the total conflict at Troy. Um, the story goes that a priest of Apollo comes who is asking to ransom his daughter back, who has been taken captive. Agamemnon decides not to ransom this young woman, and the priest is able to call upon Apollo to send a plague, and the Greeks suffer a great deal. And then Agamemnon ends up being convinced to give Chryseis back, but in order to preserve his pride as much as anything, is what it's sort of presented as, decides that he will take an equivalent, a young female slave from one of the other Achaean leaders, and decides to take it from Achilles, in part because Achilles speaks up in defense of the Achaean project as a whole, and basically tells Agamemnon that he needs to give this young woman, young female slave up. And Achilles responds by calling upon his mother Thetis, who is a sort of minor ocean deity, and tells her that his bargain, his fateful bargain, his agreement that he will stay and fight at Troy, and in exchange he will die young but be well remembered, and his honor and his glory will pass on through the ages. That the taking of Briseis is evidence of the loss of his honor, that the sort of physical manifestation of his glory has been taken away, because Agamemnon is more powerful, and that the agreement, the sort of deal with fate, has been broken. And so Achilles asks his mother Thetis to go to Zeus, the king of the gods, and cause Zeus to inspire the Trojans for as long as Achilles will not fight for the Achaeans, because he has decided that he's not going to fight until the Achaeans recognize that they need him. And so Thetis goes to Zeus and asks him to inspire the Trojans, to bring them continual victories until the Achaeans will call upon Achilles. This doesn't sit well with all of the gods. Hera and Athena, in particular, are very opposed to Troy, because Paris did not choose them in the judgment of Paris, the giving of the golden apple, and all that famous story. And so this kind of sets off this is all basically book one of the Iliad, the very beginning of the story. Warrior in Bronze and King in Splendor do not get into any of that, although that is sort of an expected familiarity, I guess you might say. The idea being that seems like the readers are sort of expected to have some knowledge of that story, because that story is kind of played with in these books. Warrior in Bronze covers Agamemnon in the kind of first portion of his life. It ends before the war, several years before the war at Troy. In the other stories around these characters, there's a lot of other stories about these characters. Agamemnon returns home and is killed by his wife Clytemnestra. Agamemnon also gains the throne, because his father was king, and there's a whole sequence of both kind of incestuous relationships and fratricidal violence between his father and his uncle. And Warrior Bronze a lot of it is about that, is this sort of backstabbing and continual violence between Atreus and Thyestes, who are Agamemnon and Menelaus' father and uncle, respectively. Um, so Warrior in Bronze starts off with very young Agamemnon, and covers his sort of youth as a squire, essentially. A companion is the term that they use. They use the term heroes and companions. Um, and heroes operate somewhat like medieval knights in the sense of um, holding estates given to them from the king, and they fight in bronze armor and ride on chariots, and they have companions who drive the chariots, and are the sort of premier military force in the period. This is also kind of against the backdrop of the eventual destruction of this particular flavor of Greek civilization, the end of the Mycenae civilization, as the Dorian Greeks are on the verge of invading, basically. Um, and in the period of Warrior in Bronze and King in Splendor, part of the sort of larger events of the world involve the gradual expansion of the Dorians, and the Dorians work iron. They understand how to work iron, and that this is a big advantage over the bronze oriented civilization of the Mycenae, and also the sort of rest of the mainland Greeks. So that's sort of broadly where the book is set. In terms of events, it covers what you might describe as kind of the later half of Greek mythology. We have events that are related to Hercules, to the seven, or Heracles, the story of the seven against Thebes, and seven against Thebes, and the Epigons, and all of the kind of details that come from this mythology, but are also presumably have some kind of historical relationship to, or some relationship to history. Some the idea being that they have a historical origination, and that this is sort of the real history of what happens. And so, um, you know, the combat is not uh, glorious the way that it can be in epic poetry. It is gritty and terrifying and blood soaked, and all of that sort of stuff, and also has to do with the kind of um, lesser impulses of the characters. The it's a major sort of through line of both of these books has to do with Agamemnon's kind of continual attempts to um, for lack of a better term, professionalize his chariot military, and convince his fighters to work in, more like formation fighting rather than as kind of individual heroes, and the sense of the kind of long term eventual change, the transition from the age of heroes into the age of you know large blocks of armies instead of individual heroic figures, is a core part of the story also. Um, so with all of that said, why read these books? Um, and I think the biggest thing is that if you're a fan of the mythology and the stories that have come down about that potentially historical period, that there's a lot to like in these books. There are a number of kind of clever reinterpretations of stories from Greek mythology. So, for instance, one of them, you may be familiar with the idea of Jason and the Argo, his ship, and the Argonauts, and the quest for the Golden Fleece. And in this story, the idea is that the Golden Fleece refers to essentially the method of a people that live in Colchis, which is on the modern day Black Sea, where there's a river that flows out of the mountains down into the Black Sea, and there's gold dust in the river, and their way of collecting the gold dust is to take sheepskins and stake them down to the bottom of the river, sort of in the silt. And the idea is that the gold dust is heavier than the river silt, and so it collects in the the wool of the sheepskin where the silt mostly passes through. And so after a certain amount of time, you pull the sheepskin up out of the river, and it looks like the golden fleece because it is covered in all this gold dust that you can collect off the sheepskin in order to have your gold ingots. And there's a lot of bits like that. There's another element that is fun is that George Shipway imagines um, that the idea that the Olympian deities that we are familiar with from Greek mythology are sort of a later invention. It's a fairly common idea in a certain period of mythological studies. The idea that deities that come to prominence later are sort of originally historical figures and kind of ancestor worship figures. And so in these stories, Zeus is considered the founder of all of these different dynasties that are present in mainland Greece, and was this sort of semi historical leader of the Achaean people into Greece from Crete, but is not actually really a deity yet. He's sort of beginning to take on that element of worship. And a number of the other Olympian deities are sort of minor similar figures. So Poseidon also appears in there. But that the kind of original mythology, the original sort of religion of these Mycenaean characters has to do with the sort of tension between two deities, one of whom is called the Lady, who sort of gradually will transform into Demeter in the later Olympian mythology, and another called Uranos, who is the father of Kronos in the Olympian mythology, the sort of grandfather of the Olympian gods, and who is this kind of um, very, very terrible chthonic deity who lives deep in the earth and has all these kind of Hades like associations with him, but also some of the elements that will be eventually transferred to the Olympian deities. So he's also responsible for thunder and lightning. That's sort of a manifestation of his power, just like earthquakes, um, which is both of those eventually are sort of moved over to the Olympian deities. Um, so I think that's where these books really shine is basically the reinterpretation of familiar elements from the mythology, from a lot of these stories that we may know. Some people who read these books may not know as well. That's okay too. Um, Alongside what is a fun um, kind of not super heroic, but kind of gritty adventure story, you might say. There's a fair bit of action. There's a number of large battles that take place and kind of exciting action scenes, very much in the vein of a lot of, especially kind of, for lack of a better term, masculine oriented historical fiction. This kind of you know the excitement of the battles and the violence and all that sort of stuff being a major source of appeal. Um, and I think it's pretty good. I think the books suffer a little bit in comparison with certain other not necessarily versions of this story, but other attempts at displaying a character like Agamemnon. Um, Agamemnon in these books is definitely calculating and manipulative, and often that comes across, but it does not kind of always come across in the way that the story is told. The kind of the sense of the unreliable narration being at a sort of extreme end of the way that a narrative can be flavored by the character that is telling it. Um, and basically, I think that almost Agamemnon isn't an unreliable enough narrator that sometimes it comes across that we the readers are meant to understand, or are able to understand the way that Agamemnon's kind of self-serving version of events is distinct from reality, and sometimes it's not as clearly distinct, and not as developed, I guess is perhaps the way to put it. Which is not, it's not the end of the world by any means. But these are pretty fun books. They're pretty easy reads. I think they're each around 300 pages, maybe 350 for Warrior in Bronze. And I think there are relatively recent Kindle editions, which is the ones I read. I didn't actually read the versions with these covers. These are the covers that these two were originally published with back when they were first published in the 70s. Um, but there's a recent republishing of these two on Kindle, which is how I read these, which is really cool. It's neat to see these two that I didn't know anything about present and available on a easy to access modern marketplace. So anyway, would I recommend these? Probably. They're not high literature, but Warrior and Bronze and King and Splendor are both pretty fun, and it's a really kind of fun way to approach all of the Greek mythology elements that I certainly enjoy, and like to see presented in a new way and all that. So anyway, that is going to be it for me for Pelham's Wasteland Reads Books for today. Leave a comment if you've read these books, I guess, or if there's something else that you want me to read to talk about. But otherwise, I've been Arlen Walker. I've been live from Pelham's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.